Are you hard? You know what else is hard? Science fiction. The Expanse recently finished its incredible run and pretty much cemented itself as one of the classic science fiction television shows. Now, one of the things that I and many others like to brag about this show is that it is a hard science fiction show. But what does that mean? What does it mean to be hard? Well, to understand what it means to be hard science fiction, first you need to define what is science fiction, and that is not an easy question to answer. I mean, there's people out there that'll just say like, oh, it's aliens in space and stuff like that. But if you just kind of reduce it to something like that, like an element or two, you're missing out on a lot of other science fiction. For example, Frankenstein, The Time Machine, any number of other works that are clearly classified as science fiction. The problem is that there's such a huge spectrum of what is science fiction, and it overlaps with other genres that can kind of muddy the waters. Case in point, something like Star Wars. Is it science fiction or is it fantasy? Well, there's spaceships and there's lasers, so obviously it's science fiction. But then you also have space wizards, which would make it fantasy. So which is it? Is it science fiction, fantasy, science fantasy? What does that mean? And if you reduce science fiction to just being about, oh, there's a piece of technology that doesn't exist in the real world, well, under that category, then aren't the Fast and Furious movies also science fiction? What about James Bond?
No. Definitely no. Positively no. Decidedly no.
Even people who have written works that are classified as science fiction don't think their works are really science fiction. Most famously, Margaret Atwood once said that The Handmaid's Tale was not a science fiction story. And science fiction's favorite cranky uncle Harlan Ellison himself once said, I don't think I've ever really been a science fiction writer. I'm closer to a fantasist, speculative fiction, whatever. But labels are ultimately derogatory, and I eschew them as best I can. Well, I'm gonna break with Uncle Harlan here and say that we kind of do need labels in some respects in order to categorize something and, know how to approach it. Now, in Harlan Ellison's case, I can see where he's coming from because he hasn't written only science fiction. He's written a lot of other genres, fantasy, horror, nonfiction. So to classify him as simply a science fiction writer really would be derogatory and robs him of a bunch of other stuff that he did. In Atwood's case, however, that is more of a case of an author not wanting to be lumped together with pulpy or what's generally considered, a low quality genre. It's a lot easier to define science fiction if you separate it from the elements and just try to look at it more broadly. Isaac Asimov once said that science fiction concerns itself with looking forward for the impact of scientific advancement on humanity, which I think is the broadest definition that we can come up with, which fits all these other different things. So, short, simple answer for the time being, science fiction is fiction that uses scientific advancement in some form in order to advance the plot and see how humanity reacts to these changes. So under that umbrella, we've got Star Wars, we got Star Trek, we got Doctor Who, we got Babylon 5, we got Farscape, we got Lex, we got all these other different properties now neatly under the science fiction umbrella. So now the question is, what does it mean to be hard? Well, TV Tropes has a handy little scale called the Mohs scale of science fiction hardness. Now, TV Tropes didn't come up with the idea of hard science fiction, but this is a nice little way of kind of explaining what it means to be hard in, respect to science. The simple answer as to what it means to be hard science fiction is, how seriously does your story take science? How much does it stick with what we know is physically possible? How much does it deviate from it? The scale goes from 1, being science is just kind of an afterthought, to 5, which is diamond hard science. Like, this is the world and this is what we're going to use. So, for example, on the hard end, you've got speculative fiction that is, this is what we know and this is what we're going to use. Take, for example, something like The Martian. There is nothing in The Martian that is physically impossible. It's all based on what we know is possible. We may not be able to build some of these machines yet, but they're not impossible. They stick with the laws of science, and in fact, physics and biology and all these different things are integral to the plot. Physics and science in general drives the plot of The Martian. A movie like Gravity is also considered to be science fiction. In fact, it's kind of an alternate history because at the time that it was released, we no longer had a shuttle program. And in that movie too, the laws of physics dictate what is going to happen. And humans react to these things, and their reactions are what drives the story. It is first and foremost a human story, but it's driven by the laws of physics. Now you start moving below that to level 4 and things start getting a little softer. This is what TV Tropes calls one big lie. Now this is the one where there's just maybe 1 or 2 pieces of technology or 1 or 2 new things that have been added that maybe we can't explain it with normal physics, but we're just gonna assume that they work. Take for example, Back to the Future. The only really futuristic or technologically advanced thing is the DeLorean, the time machine. Everything else is kind of built around this new element. A movie like Inception as well. How does hacking into a dream work? Who cares? But it works, and that also drives the plot along. So as you start moving down on the list, things start getting softer as more and more things are added. Around the 2 or 3 mark, there is a bunch of stuff that's being added, but it should, in theory, be internally consistent. Something like, for example, Stargate. A lot of alien technologies get introduced, the Stargates themselves, but there's a set of rules to how they work, right? There is still some kind of logic to how these things operate, and those rules set up how the stories themselves function. And at the very bottom of the list, you have what's called really soft science fiction, where they may reference scientific theories, but sometimes it's really just mumbo jumbo, or they're getting it wrong. And at that level, you just kind of have to stop trying to think about it too hard and just kind of go along with the story.
You said this was the 51st century.
I also said this ship was generating enough power to punch a hole in the universe. I think we just found the hole. Must be a spatio-temporal hyperlink.
What's that?
No idea, just made it up. Didn't want to say magic door.
So then, is this scale something that we can use to define what is really good science fiction? Well, some people might argue, and at one point I did the same, that the harder it is, it's a mark of quality. And I still believe that to a point. But somebody like Harlan Ellison, once famously said that the greatest science fiction show of all time was Doctor Who, and Doctor Who is really low on that scale. Also, any science fiction story that deals with what are called the soft sciences, like sociology or psychology or something like that, is generally fairly low on this scale. There's usually nothing that is too out there for these things. Alternate history, for example, 1984, The Handmaid's Tale. These are science fiction works, and yet nobody really thinks about them as science fiction. Nobody talks about how hard they are, right? In the end, judging a work simply by how realistic it is and how much it sticks with the laws of physics, I think is very short-sighted. Yes, it is important though, depending on the kind of story that you're trying to tell. If you're trying to tell a realistic story, if you're trying to really immerse an audience, it helps to make it something that they can identify. If the laws of physics work, great, then we have a sense of what's going to happen. But even if you're going to add new rules, like for example, Stargate and its Stargates, it helps to stay internally consistent. It helps to set up rules, stick to those rules, and if you have to add new stuff, make sure you don't contradict yourself. Because the mark of a really great story isn't necessarily its rules or what it's trying to do with those rules, but really how immersed a reader gets into the story. The most alluring stories are the ones where the characters are at the main center. Yes, all this other hard stuff, the science and all these things, they're on the edge, but they're not the ones that are really driving the plot. We're talking about the people and their reactions to these different things. Now take Star Trek, for example, and I'm saying this here like a second-generation Trekkie, okay? Some of Star Trek's best episodes are the ones where it's really about the people. It's really not a lot about the technobabble or the new science or the special effects or the battle scenes or all these different things. The best episodes of Star Trek are the ones about people. You think City on the Edge of Forever is, this, time travel drama? Well, it's a drama, but it's really about Kirk trying to figure out if he's willing to sacrifice one life for the rest of humanity to survive. You think Measure of a Man is about AI and all these different things? Well, it kind of is, but at the same time, it's also mostly about how we are going to eventually react to having created a new species, new life. And The Pale Moonlight is a war story in space, but it's only about trying to figure out if you are willing to sacrifice your morality when billions of lives are at stake. What are you willing to do? What lines are you willing to cross? But when Star Trek is bad, it is entirely self-indulgent. It is technobabble. It is the particle of the week. It is routed through the deflector. All great science fiction stories, in the end, are about humanity, about people. being confronted with something strange and something new, and that interaction being an allegory for something that's going on today. Science fiction authors are generally not trying to actually predict the future. They're using that future, these stories, to put a mirror up to you and ask you, what would you do in this situation? This is not really about space. This is not really about aliens. This is about you right now. What, you think something like WandaVision, which was critically acclaimed, you think people are really associating with a mutant/witch who was superpowered by a physical fragment of the creation of the universe, who lost her robot boyfriend to an intergalactic warlord and was so consumed by grief that she telekinetically took over a town and is living in a TV fantasy land, as we all have? The show was about grief and the immigrant experience and things that a lot of people could see themselves in. So yes, I still think that it's very good if your story is hard. But much more importantly, I'm more concerned if your story is consistent. If you're writing a police procedural, you better know what the law is. You better know what a cop can and cannot do. So in this regard, science fiction is a lot more difficult to create and maintain that consistency. So let's stop pretending that the reason that something like The Expanse was so popular is because it was hard. The Expanse was about more than just the physics and getting all that right. It was about the people that are involved in situations because of geopolitics of the solar system. Science good, consistency better. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed that. If you like what you saw, go ahead and hit that like button. Go ahead and subscribe, hit that notification bell, sign on to Patreon, support the channel. I will see you later.